Hello friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time, and I'm starting a series on tips and tricks in the kitchen. This is going to be focused mostly on cooking and baking, ways that you can use various food products that in different dishes that maybe you've never thought of doing before that will have lots of various benefits. And also, what today is going to be specifically about is learning ways to measure and how to make it a little bit easier and quicker when you're whipping up your different recipes. And I don't know how many parts is going to be to this series. I know for sure there's going to be at least 2, but I'm pretty sure it's going to grow into something with quite a few parts to it as I go along. So the first thing I want to talk about when it comes to measurements is the importance of understanding your measurements. Now keep in mind, I'm talking on your American standard types of measurements. So obviously knowing what a cup is. We can break a cup down easy, most of us, into a half cup, 2/3 cup, 3/4 cup, a quarter cup, and things like that. And when you have when you're working with a full cup measuring cup like this particular one, where you've got all the measurements in there, that makes it easy. Same thing with your glass measuring cups for your liquid ingredients, where you can see through and see the measurements. That's also going to be very helpful and very recommended you have something like that on hand. But one thing that people don't think to break it down into is your tablespoons and teaspoons and things like that. So let's go down to the smaller level and let's go over what these equal. Because a lot of people might not have an idea how many teaspoons are in a tablespoon. And though I realize this is math and not everybody's into math, when you have a way to use your math and apply it in your life, it does get easy to memorize. I was not great at math in school. However, and I never learned my multiples because it was more out of laziness. I just didn't see the need to take the time to do that. But when I started crocheting many years ago, especially when I got into working with amigurumi, where you work in a spiral, you need to understand your multiples. Well, it suddenly became easy for me to memorize my multiples. It was just, I had a way to use it. I had purpose. And cooking and baking involves a lot of math. And when you get into it and you enjoy it, you will be able to put that math to use and you will find it much easier to retain such information. So, how many teaspoons are in a tablespoon? That would be 3. Once you know that, once you understand 3 teaspoons in a tablespoon, it's going to make a lot of other things so much easier. So let's say you're going to half a recipe, and that recipe calls for a tablespoon of baking powder, such as biscuits. So you're going to go in half, and you just want to make a few biscuits. Well, what do you need? You need 1.5 teaspoons. Yes, you can use a half tablespoon measuring spoon if you happen to have one, and that's fine. But knowing it in teaspoons is going to be very helpful. I recently did a video on a pineapple coconut banana bread, and my recipe had 4.5 teaspoons of baking powder. But to me, I also think of that as 1.5 tablespoons, because I understand how many teaspoons are in a tablespoon, or even 1.5 teaspoons. And why would I say it that way? Because when it comes to my baking powder, I keep, and a couple other things like this, my baking soda is the same way, my container of baking soda, I keep this little measuring spoon. Years ago we got into this kind of vitamin drink mix that then later we realized was junk, but thankfully I kept these little measuring cups out of there, because I found out by measuring it myself, these hold exactly 1.5 teaspoons or a half tablespoon of whatever it is you're using. So if I need to half a recipe and the recipe calls for a tablespoon, I can use this and know that's half a tablespoon. So yes, understanding that is going to make your life so much easier. Now let's talk a little bit more about this as far as tablespoons is concerned. So you have a 1/4 cup, which here is going to be right to here on this 1 cup measuring cup. A 1/4 cup is equal to 4 tablespoons, which would also tell you then that a half cup would be 8 tablespoons, and so on. So learn these more basic, smaller measurements like that. So again, 3 teaspoons per tablespoon, 4 tablespoons per quarter cup. Knowing that's going to help you a lot when you're working in the kitchen and trying out recipes or wanting to double or half or triple recipes or quarter recipes. Whatever it is you're doing, understand these smaller measurements is going to make a big difference in your ease of being able to create a recipe that's going to work for you as far as the right amount for you. Maybe it's just you and your spouse, or maybe it's you and your 10 kids. Whatever it is, understanding these measurements is going to help you a lot. Now, to make life even more easier, learn how to use your hand and your lids for measuring so that you don't have to always pull out your measuring spoon and look for the right size. So let me go over how you can get yourself familiarized with how much is what when you measure with your hand or even a lid. Okay, so we're going to be starting with some dry ingredients. So let's go back to the baking powder. So when I take, the first thing you want to do, because you got to remember, I can show you what things look like in my hand, but I'm a small person. I have little hands. And so in my hand, things are going to look a lot bigger, the volume's going to look like a lot more than it will in your hand if you have medium to large hands. So put that tablespoon of baking powder in the middle of your hand and look at how much of your hand it fills up. I would say even kind of move it around a little bit so you can really see how that looks. You can see that a tablespoon, I can barely hold a full tablespoon in my hand. Then the next thing you do is, if you have your ingredients in jars like the way I do it, that take that same tablespoon and put it in the lid and kind of shake it around and see how much of that lid it fills up. So you can get an idea if you're going to use your lid for measuring, which I don't for the baking powder because I have that little scooper in there, but I do for other things like salt and spices and whatnot, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Then the next thing I recommend you do is pour that same amount into a regular size mixing bowl, the size that you're going to use most frequently, to see how that looks in the mixing bowl. So that if you're just going to pour it in there, you can see how much you can add in there. Though I still recommend pouring it into the lid or your hand so that you can control. If you've already got your flour and all that kind of stuff in there, you don't want to just pour it in there and then have a big bloop come out and then you have way too much and you won't be able to separate it after that. But still, it's a good idea to kind of look at it in the bowl and see how much that really is. I don't know if you pick this up or not, but to me it always looks like so much more in the bowl or in my hand than it does in the spoon itself. Okay, so we're going to pour this back in here. Now I'm just going to take a dry, clean cloth and wipe that out because I'm going to use this for something else that I want to be able to pour back into the jar. And I will be making a mess on the counter. That's just me. So let's move on. Now let's talk about measuring salt. Salt's going to look a little different than your baking powder because of the way the weight of it and the weight it's going to fall. So I recommend doing the same kind of measurements with your salt. Take a tablespoon, I'm going to hold it over the bowl and see how that looks. Okay, it still fills up the same amount in my hand, and yet the weight is different in the way it kind of wants to spread out on my hand. Again, pour it in your bowl or pour it in your lid that goes to that same thing and see how that looks, and then pour it into your bowl and then see how that looks. Okay, get very familiar with this. There's very little difference between the salt and the baking powder, but there is a little bit of a difference. Now let's move on to the teaspoon, because when you're working with salt and things like that in other spices, most likely you're using a teaspoon or less anyway. So let's do the same idea with a teaspoon. Okay, I pour it into my hand and see how that looks in the palm of my hand. Now this is what I'm guessing people with larger hands, this is probably how a tablespoon is going to look in your hand. Pour it into the lid and see how that looks. Okay, so that way you can just pour the salt or the whatever it is right into your lid and then pour it into your bowl and take a look at that. Okay, you can see it doesn't fill up near as much because it's only a third of as much as the whole tablespoon was. Okay, we're going to pour this back in here. And again, I'm going to wipe this out. And we'll try a couple other things. I'm going to move on to some sugar simply because the sugar is in a different, it has a different kind of lid to it. It's a different shape. It's deeper and not as wide as the one on this particular jar. This isn't actually a canning jar, so the size of this is actually between a wide mouth and a regular mouth, so it's kind of unique. But I really like these for storing a lot of herbs and spices. So same thing, whoops, I'm about ready to do it the way I normally do when I'm just measuring stuff out. Let's do a teaspoon. See how I already know how it's going to look in my hand, so let's just see how it looks in the lid. Okay, let's put a couple more teaspoons in there so that we can see how it looks as a tablespoon. So 3 teaspoons in a tablespoon, so that's a tablespoon. Those were a little bit slightly rounded a teaspoon, so this is more than a tablespoon, but anyway, this is going to give you an idea. A lot of your recipes, some certain measurements do not have to be absolutely accurate, and that's, you know, we're kind of taught that there are certain things that is very important, but most of your recipes you don't need absolute exact measurements. And by the way, if you are working in milliliters and things like that, this same method of measuring with your hand is going to work for you. And I should have said that earlier so I didn't scare anyone off of at least watching this video and learning ways that you can learn how to measure with your hand. So just take your standard measurements, whatever they be in the UK, Canada, and so on, and then try those out in your hand and see how it looks. Do the same method using the lids and the bowl and your hand just to get an idea. Okay, so let me wipe this out again, and we're going to go ahead and move on to some liquid ingredients. All right, now let's talk about our liquid ingredients. And one thing I forgot to go over earlier was ounces. Also understand how many ounces are in each of your different measurings. So when you've got a 1/4 cup, that's 2 ounces. So you know that 1 cup has 8 ounces, and so on and so forth. Obviously 2 cups or a pint is going to be 16 ounces, and so on. These things are really important to understand and be able to break it down by your weight as well as by the actual measurement. But since I'm showing you how to use sight for measurement, this is why I'm talking more about tablespoons and things like that. So let's start with extract. Usually when you're using an extract in something, you're going to use about a teaspoon. I often use up to a tablespoon, but let's go ahead and do a teaspoon of my homemade vanilla extract so we can see what that looks like. So I've got this wonderful little shot glass that has measurements of all kinds, and it also includes milliliters. So those of you who go by the metric, these kind of things are going to be very important, especially if you also, for whichever measurement you use, it's nice to have this to be able to convert it. Then you can look at the US measurements and then the metric measurements as well and compare them side by side. So 1 teaspoon is right here. So we're going to fill that up to there. And obviously I'm not holding it level. That's just a little bit too much. Go ahead and set it on a flat surface so you can double check your measurement. Okay, so you can see what that looks like there. Obviously, I'm not going to pour this one in my hand, but I am going to pour it into the bowl so I can see how much of the bowl that fills up and what that looks like in there and something that size. So that's what the vanilla extract looks like in the bowl, 1 teaspoon. Okay, so now I have my handy dandy little miniature funnel, so we're going to pour that back in there. Okay, and there's a reason why I did the vanilla first. I don't want vinegar in my vanilla, but I don't mind a little vanilla in my vinegar. Okay, so now we're going to use some homemade apple vinegar. I believe this one's apple anyway. It could be, no, that one could be peach, but anyway, I think it's apple. And let's see what a tablespoon, or 3 teaspoons in other words, looks like. And a tablespoon is also going to be 1/2 of an ounce. Okay, so 3 teaspoons, 1 tablespoon, 1/2 of an ounce, and let's see what that is in milliliters. That's 15 milliliters. Okay, so now we're going to pour that into the bowl. And it's also a good idea just to see what it looks like in something like this. So even if you want to use a little glass for measurement, but maybe you don't have the measurements on it, seeing how that looks on there is going to be helpful too. Just get used to how far up the glass that fills. Now we pour that into the bowl and we take a look at it. Okay, it might be kind of harder because the bowl is clear. Maybe if I used a solid white bowl, but this is I use this bowl quite a bit for making things. So now I know what that looks like as I'm pouring it in there. Obviously, you got to be careful. You're going to pour it directly into your batter or whatever it is. You got to be careful not to go overboard. It might be safer to pour it into a glass of some sort and see your measurement and then pour it into your batter. But I'm the kind of person, I just pour it right in there, and I don't get concerned about getting a little bit too much when it comes to these types of things, especially any kind of extract. I don't mind getting a little extra. Okay, well that's it for my tips and tricks for today for your kitchen, for cooking and baking, learning how to measure by sight and using your hands and using lids and whatever it is you've got. Just kind of practice with it. The more you see it and the more you do it, the more you just won't even have to think about it. You'll just know what it looks like. I love not always having to depend on measuring spoons and measuring cups and things like that to know how much of what I need in something, especially when it's your smaller amount things. I don't mind using my measuring cup when I'm making breads and I just need to pull out a cup at a time. I need something to scoop it out with anyway, so that just makes sense. But when it comes to measuring spices and herbs and extracts and anything that's on the smaller scale, I really like the ease of being able to go by sight, and that gives me one less thing that I have to wash too. Okay, well I hope you enjoyed this video and be watching for more to come. And if you've got any special tips and tricks that you like to use in your kitchen, especially if you think they're unique, go ahead and share them down below so we can learn from you too. Thanks for watching, take care, and God bless.